right. Hello, welcome everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started because I know we have just so much that we'd like to say and do today. We don't want to waste any time. I appreciate all of you taking time out of what I'm sure are incredibly busy weeks to be with us here today, and I hope that we can get through lots of things that are exciting and interesting for you. So. Just to make sure you're in the right place, this is a webinar with Complete College America and at Astra to talk about where to begin when we're integrating degree maps, advising, and smart scheduling. So a few technical details. This is in webinar format, you might have noticed, as opposed to a meeting. So if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A section, and we will try to answer some of them as we go. We're expecting a pretty large group today, and so instead of holding them all and just having a big long question and answer session at the end, we'll try to get you some answers as we go, but then there will be a little bit of time to do some live Q&A toward the end. And we will have information about the people that are on the call in case you want to do some follow-up or have some questions. I also just want to let people know that this is being recorded and that everybody who has registered for this meeting will be getting an email afterwards with a copy both of the recording and of the slide deck. So anything that comes up in the slide deck, you will have access to after this meeting. And then also just some links to some other things and some other information. So again, thank you all for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So Laura, can you? So I am Laura Schuler. I am a strategy director here at Complete College America. The other people that you see on the screen are our friends from at Astra, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit later in just a couple of minutes. But I just want to talk about Complete College America's thinking about smart scheduling to sort of set us up with some context here. So at CCA, we talk about institutional transformation when we talk about sort of how we transform entire institutions. And the reason that we do that is because we recognize that there is not any single campus unit or function that is an island, right? That as soon as you do something in one, it's affected by and it affects other things on campus. And so changes in one space either can really support or they can work against changes in others. And so when we think about smart scheduling, I really think about smart scheduling as meeting the needs of students, right? So that is using smart scheduling means using scheduling as a student success strategy. And it's no surprise that if we want to meet the needs of students, we actually have to know what those needs are. So I don't think it's any surprise that in order to do smart scheduling, we have to have academic maps in place. That is, we have to know what courses students are going to need, right? But not just in theory, these maps out in the world, but students actually have to be on ed plans that are informed by those academic maps. So not just what courses would students need if they were all on these perfect academic maps, but what students actually need. And that means collecting information from advisors and also knowing what it means for each student to be staying on track, right? Like not just generically that they are full-time or they're part-time, but that they are working on 15 to finish, which 15 credits per semester they're going to be taking, or they at least have a plan to stay on track for their own graduation goals. There are also lots of other things that come into play, right? There are students that come in that are going to need co-requisite supports for some of their classes, and so they may need a few extra credits in one semester compared to some of their peers. And so just all of those things need to go into building this smart schedule. And so can we just go to the next slide? And so our goal today, and really with smart scheduling in general, is thinking about all of those areas, right, that go into informing smart scheduling and are affected by smart scheduling and can affect smart scheduling, and thinking about how we operationalize those things. What does it mean to operationalize getting students onto ed plans that are informed by academic maps? What does it mean to then cement those business practices into place, right? So that it's not just one person does a whole lot of work and writes a great schedule and then we keep it forever. No, that we actually continue to have business practices where we are continuing to collect information. We are continuing to see what it is that the students that we have each year and each semester and every time that we make other changes, we know what our students are going to need. And so that's sort of how we think about smart scheduling at Complete College America. And I am just really excited that today we have some people here with us from Astra who have done just a ton of work across individual institutions and systems and states in helping them operationalize their own practices in order to build smart schedules and to work towards smart scheduling. I think if you're like me, when you think about all those sort of moving parts, it can seem overwhelming. Like that there's we might really believe that we want to build schedules based on the needs of students. But when we think about how to do that, it can just seem so huge and so overwhelming. Like thinking about, okay, but I don't have every one of my students on an ed plan. I don't have all of this data coming in. I don't have all of these things yet. And so having these partners here from Ad Astra that have really worked on these exact questions with institutions and systems and states, they have actually been able to help people figure out how to get started. And that's really what we're talking about today, that you don't have to go right from, yeah, we believe it's a good idea, to full implementation with one jump off the cliff, right? That's really, there are steps that need to be in place. And that there is really some well-established pathways for how you get started and some things that you need to do. And so at this time, I want to introduce Laura Hunter, and I'm gonna let Laura introduce herself and sort of take it away. So thank you.
So thank you, Laura, for that introduction. We're happy to be here today. We appreciate very much our partnership with Complete College America. Certainly they're a thought leader in this space. I am going to pause for just a second and let my colleagues introduce themselves really quickly. So starting with Nicole and then with Susan, and then we'll come back to me.
Hey everyone, I'm Nicole Dingley. I am the VP of Marketing at Ad Astra and really excited to see you all here today.
Hi everyone, I'm Susan English with Ad Astra, and I work with our clients to work through these processes and really help folks deliver the smart scheduling steps to help students be successful.
So Susan is going to, and Nicole are going to be monitoring the chat. I mean, I'm not the chat, the Q&A. So as you have questions, feel free to drop those in, and then they will prompt me along the way with some of those questions. So again, thanks very much for being here. We're excited to talk about smart scheduling. And so we're going to just start here with these pillars of smart scheduling. In the top right corner of this screen, there is a QR code where you can download our smart scheduling guidebook. As Laura mentioned, we are going to provide these slides to you. So if you don't get that right away, then that's okay. We're going to provide you with both the slides, and we'll send along that guidebook as well. So no worries if you don't get that right off the bat here. But you can see the pillars associated with scheduling here that we're going to talk through today. The first one is knowledge. So how are you able to gain information about your current scheduling practices, about your students, about your institutional profile, and how can that help you from a scheduling perspective? The second one is around culture. And so we all know how very important the culture at your institution is in terms of the way to be able to support systemic change. Kind of piggybacking off of something that Laura just said, you know, what is the best way to get started? You know, can this be an overwhelming process? And so sometimes the cultural aspects of this can make this feel harder than it actually is. And so one of the recommendations that we have is just start. Figure out something, what's the nugget or takeaway, and we're going to get to those in just a moment, that you can take away and do pretty immediately, knowing that sometimes that's a part of a bigger picture, you know, a bigger project that needs to move forward. And that's where you get into some of the process and policy that's in that third pillar. So it's not always easy to redefine our processes and our policies, the guidelines that we use associated with scheduling, but sometimes that's really important work for us to be able to move forward. And finally, the final pillar here that we're talking about is that concept of technology. And so I like to think of that also as scaling. So technology sometimes feels like a burden to us out in the field, but it really should be designed in a way that can help us be able to move towards our goals from an institutional perspective, and how can it improve the needs of our students. I loved what Laura mentioned, which is the goal of smart scheduling is really to meet the needs of our students. And so I think we all believe that, but then in practice, we act sometimes in slightly different ways. And so those are some things that we're going to go through, just a high level overview. But now we're going to dive in a little bit deeper and talk about some of the knowledge that you might need. And so you can see here, know your data, know your students, know your KPIs. But what's important about that, and as we work with institutions, some of the first questions that we ask are, who do you serve? What is your student population like? What is your institutional profile? What are your goals? And then also diving a little bit deeper down to that program or department level. What are your goals at the departmental level? What are you trying to accomplish from your program perspective? And knowing the data that's important to you at those levels, knowing your students in each one of those areas is really important. And so what that means is you have to canvas and figure out, okay, what data do we already have that's at our fingertips? So most of you have systems in place, student information system, reporting systems. In many cases, we have lots and lots of data that's available to us, but it's difficult for us to turn that into information that we can use. And so the next thing that I really want to talk about is you should know your goals. Think about your strategic plan. What are you trying to accomplish? Where are those key areas that you want to be able to move the needle? And so along that way, and as you're defining those key performance indicators, it's important to know that you can have almost metric overload. And so if you want to be able to determine if you're moving the needle, you can't look at every single metric that you have available to you. You have to key in on those that are most important. And so for most of our institutions, what that means is we want to find 5 to 8 metrics that we can evaluate on a term-by-term, year-by-year basis to figure out how to move the needle. Several years ago, I was meeting with Tim Rennick from the National Institute for Student Success, and he said, what is the one metric that you can give me that is most important? And it was difficult, right? Because there's a lot of things at play that we can consider. And so having that diligence to be able to narrow that focus and understand which data elements are most important to us will help you move the needle. The next area is around culture. And so one of the things that I would recommend here, and we'll include a link when we send out this, is to read an article from Adriana Kazar, and it's called Creating a Diverse Student Success Infrastructure. It was published in 2019. And so in her model, she has 9 different components. And so I'm going to list them out for you just because I think it's interesting in terms of how that might relate to what you're seeing here within the pillars. But in her 9-part model, she includes planning, decision-making and governance, information and institution research, finance and resources, policies, facilities and IT, incentives and rewards, HR and development, and metrics and accountability. And so I want to just plug for a moment the first one that I listed there, which is planning, because we're going to come back to it in just a moment. But if you think about it, those 9, I think, really do kind of embed themselves pretty nicely into this 4-part model. But one of the key things that she talks about is not only creating a diverse student success infrastructure, but the ability for that to create equity and transparency within an institution. And one of the key components of that that's so important is collaboration. And in particular, one thing is to think through this concept of self-assessment. So where are you as an institution? What is your culture like? And so some of the things that are listed here can be really, really important. How do we ask questions of all of those key constituencies, advisors, students, department chairs, faculty? How do we understand those things? What is our definition of student success for our institution, and how does that guide our thinking about how we want to be able to move the needle on smart scheduling? And then finally, how do we really think through what each person has in terms of their role and the purpose and how they're going about working with student scheduling? You can see on the right-hand side that we have a quote from one of our clients, Phil Hunt. And so one of the key takeaways that he had from some of our early work was really just making sure that you have that definition of student success. When we work with institutions in something that we call a core schedule infrastructure diagnostic, oftentimes what we see is that institutions score pretty highly in terms of what does it mean for us to be successful from a student lens, but it doesn't always coalesce into a single definition. And so that's something that can be really important from a cultural impact as you start down this process. Around process and policy, there are a lot of things that we need to consider as we look at this in particular. As we're formerly working in the registrar's office, and I'm just now realizing that I didn't actually introduce myself. So Laura Hunter, VP of Value and Insights at Astra, but I came from an institution where I worked in enrollment management in the registrar's office. And so process and policy obviously is what guides you from an institutional lens. And so really, really important to be able to understand those institutional policies and processes. I was at a recent in-person session where they were going through and talking about the importance of what the outputs of systems are. And so when you think about your process and policy, what you're hoping for is that guides your system to the intended result. And so in this case, oftentimes what's guiding that end result is, do we have a schedule that's published? But that's just one step in this. What we really need to ensure is that we have a schedule that's published. It works for our departments, it works for our students, and ultimately moves them towards that credential or degree that they're seeking. And so a lot of times what we need to think through here is, what are those key policies and scheduling guidelines that we have? Where are there gaps? What are we missing? Are we communicating what those policies and processes are? And then ultimately, is that end result, are we actually doing the work product that would take advantage of those policies and procedures? So in many cases, when we come into an institution, what we sometimes see is they have, for example, a meeting pattern grid, but the adherence to that grid is not always great. So you have the policy in place, but you aren't really taking that into account, and the work product doesn't show that you're utilizing that to be able to help your students be successful. And so that's an area where we can continue to work. The final one is around technology. So looking at your student information system, what's available to you within that, how can you use data there? Are there other pieces of the puzzle that you need to use? So sometimes there's some gaps within our student information systems that can't get us quite as far as we want to be able to get. And so that's where we can start to look at other auxiliary types of systems. How can they plug into our student information system and provide additional benefit, additional ways to be able to process the data? I'm going to look at this fourth bullet point here too. I just want to call attention to it really quickly, which is around cross-training. So sometimes what we find is that we have training that exists in certain pockets. We know that there's a lot of turnover in the industry. And so sometimes maybe you have that opportunity where someone really knows how to effectively use either the technological system or the process itself. But when that person leaves, is that bench available? And so if you think about building infrastructure, that's an important component as well. So one thing that I want to point out here is that we just released a 2024 benchmark report. And you can see, again, we have a QR code up in the top right corner. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we are going to have a follow-up webinar where we dive much deeper into kind of the relationship between scheduling effectiveness, progress, and completion. But one of the things that I want to talk about is this is why smart scheduling is so important. We talk a lot about the completion promises that we make to students. They come to our institution and they expect to be able to graduate hopefully in either 2 or 4 years. We know that sometimes that's not a reality, and we want to think about why those things are happening. What can we see in terms of the students' ability to get their courses and maybe get their courses conflict-free, and how does that either slow down the process of getting that degree, or does it sometimes inhibit the ability for them to be able to complete? So more to come on that later, but certainly something that's of interest to us as we continue to think through the process that students go through in terms of the key component that scheduling plays in their ability to get through their degree program. So that leads us to the central focus of this webinar today. So how do we integrate our degree maps, advising, and smart scheduling? There's a couple things here that we know. This is hard work. And so I want to acknowledge that up front. It's complicated. And so Laura in her introductory remarks said the word overwhelming. And so sometimes it can feel that way. We also know that sometimes this work is done a little bit in a siloed approach. So we have folks that are in the departments working on the degree maps and determining that sequencing. We know that in the advising units, boots on the ground, they're meeting with the students individually. Hopefully they're translating those academic maps into the educational plans, and they're understanding the perspective of every single student. And then we have to have a system system for scheduling that takes all of that into account. And so sometimes we fall down a little bit because we have some silos associated with how we go about doing that. There's a quote from a movie. Ad Astra is known for loving movie quotes, so I'm just contributing to that at this point. And so it's from a Tom Hanks movie, and Gina Davis, and I maybe can't even remember the name, A League of Her Own, and he's asking her, you know, or he's asking her why it's important be able to play baseball, and that's kind of the reference, and he says it's the hard that makes it great. And so I want to challenge you as you're thinking about degree maps and advising and how to build the schedule. We know that it's difficult, but if this is one of those central things that's going to help students be able to move forward, it's the hard that makes that makes it so great, that makes this work worth the effort. So a couple things to just point out there. We know that students have challenges associated with their registration. And so I'm not going to go through all of these details. Certainly you can read the types of questions that we're asking, but I want to focus on one thing, which is, can I get a good schedule? And so there's a lot of things listed here about, you know, the plight that students have. And so as a parent, I have a couple college age students. And so I sometimes see firsthand, can they get the schedule that they want? And I think even the definition of a good schedule is something that's really interesting, right? Does it mean that they can only take classes from 10 to 2, Monday through Friday? Does it mean they can only get a certain amount of classes? Do they want a break during the middle of the day, or do they want a very compact schedule? And so one of the things that we know is that oftentimes that definition of a good schedule is going to be dependent on the student. But we also know that we have an obligation to understand what meeting the needs of the student means. And so, and oftentimes that means we need to ask them some of those questions. So what are the parameters associated with your student body in terms of how you need to offer classes, and how has that changed over time? So oftentimes in that kind of roll forward scheduling situation that we're in at many institutions, that means that we think we know what our student population is doing, but we need to challenge whether that's really what's happening. In terms of, are we meeting the needs of our student body now, knowing that we see some trends, you know, post-COVID in terms of what our students want in terms of their ability to get the courses that they need. Here's something that we've consistently seen over time. You can see that this is from the National Student Satisfaction and Priorities Report from 2021, but for about a decade, we've seen a similar phenomenon where students are noting that it's important or very important to them to be able to get the courses that they need without conflict. But we also see that about 40% of students are not satisfied with that process. They're not satisfied with their ability to get the courses that they need during that registration process. And so in the old days, sometimes I used to get some pushback here, and I used to really hear, well, it's not that they can't get a schedule, it's that they are very specific in what they need or want. But in practice, as I'm traveling around, as I'm having these types of conversations, what I found is it's very much an issue where students are not able to get that full schedule. And so I think as we continue to move forward, you'll see that as well. So we've talked about the students, we've talked about kind of their issues. One of the things that I would mention in that same Ruffalo Mel-Levitz survey, when you look at institutional challenges, offering the courses that students need never comes up in the top 10 of something that they see as a challenge. And so there's a disconnect in terms of what students are asking for, which is something very basic, and what we from an institutional perspective are focusing on. But here's some things in terms of challenges for institutions. Same thing. I am not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I want to note that none of these questions that I'm asking are about course scheduling. But we know that they're embedded in all of them in some way, right? So how do we support different types of students that are coming into our institution? How are we sure that we're being inclusive and that we're supporting equitable outcomes? How do we ensure that the schedule that we're offering allows the students to be able to get that schedule, and that we are able to be financially sustainable in the offerings that we're making? So all of these types of questions, and it speaks in many ways to your strategic plan. So what are the key things here from an institutional perspective that we need to be able to do? And we aren't even using the words course scheduling, advising, education plans, or smart scheduling in any of these statements. But that means that our smart scheduling plan has to be very, very diverse in terms of understanding all of these things as it's embedded into that process. So one of the things that we think is that pathways can be that key piece of infrastructure that can start to narrow that field down and help it be kind of that building block that we work through. So when we were building this presentation, we were having a conversation, and Laura Schuler said, I think everyone gets that this is difficult. I think everyone knows that this is just hard. And so we don't even need a slide that outlines the fact that this is really complicated. And so hopefully that's true and you all get that. But ultimately, one of the first things that we have to do from an institutional perspective is even get on the same page with what the words mean. And so for Ad Astra, we use the word pathway, and you can see the definition there. Basically, the ideal way that the students would complete their program of study. We are acknowledging that there are other words that people use for the same thing. And so you can see that listed there: plan of study, semester by semester guide. And you can see that from a CCA perspective, they're really calling them academic maps and milestones. And you can see that definition on the right. So it delineates the path to graduation and highlights any significant milestones that contribute to student success in a clear and comprehensive format. So step one is, what is a degree map and how do we make sure that they're available for all students? The next step is really around this idea that there's a continuum. So step one is, do we have pathways at all? And so most institutions that we work with, as we're looking at this slide, are in the define pathways or analyze pathways area. So they're making sure that they're out there and they're available to students. It's recommending, certain courses. It's looking at the refinement process. It's trying to align the pathways to scheduling practices. But we don't have many institutions that are able to kind of move the needle into scheduling for pathways. If you think about kind of what we're discussing here, the ability to think through the correlation between advising, smart scheduling, and using those degree maps. And really that's kind of in this refinement phase where you have full integration of advising, scheduling, and registration, which means the student sees their pathway, they know the courses that they need to take, they go and discuss it with their advisor, and then when they go to register, those courses are available to them. And not only that we're able to use this continuous improvement model where we're able to see, okay, are there any issues from a momentum year perspective? Are we seeing some issues where students aren't making adequate progress from a degree velocity lens? Are we seeing that some of the students are getting bottlenecked in certain areas? And how do we change our pathways, or how do we change how students flow through those pathways from a scheduling perspective to ensure that we're optimizing for student success? I'm going to hit you with a few data points here. And so let's talk about this. So we did an analysis of about 15 institutions in a cohort as we were looking at how pathways align with scheduling. And what we found is that 26% of required courses are not offered in the term that is listed on the pathway. So again, think about that for a second. Doesn't mean that they're not offered at all. They're just not offered in alignment with what's on the pathway. So 26% of required courses not offered in the term that's listed on the pathway. 11% of offerings are electives only, so do not meet an absolute requirement in any way, and they have low demand, which means 10 or less students are registered in those pathways. 40% of courses we considered would benefit from some sort of alignment change. So that could mean that you're balancing the offerings between fall and spring, or it could be that you're combining some of the offerings that have low demand into a single term. And then we also did some analysis work that speaks to, are we recommending that students take certain elective courses that have high DFW rates? So for example, if you have 5 different science courses that fulfill requirements, but students who are majoring in psychology are much less likely to be successful in one of those science courses, does it make sense for us to include that as an option? So I'm not saying it does or it doesn't, but those are the types of things that we want to be able to think through from a scheduling perspective. And that's the type of data that we can do if we are in this refinement of pathways perspective. Step one, of course, is we need to have the pathways as that set of infrastructure. But what type of data are we using, and how can we help use that data to analyze those pathways and make sure that we want to move students in the right direction? Okay. So this is an example of what happens. So you can see this top student is completely on path. They see their pathway, they go to register, and they're able to get all the classes that they want. But unfortunately, what happens in reality is more like this second student that's listed at the bottom. So the student needs to register for English 106, but all the sections are full. They want to take biology 125, but instead they are advised to take an alternative class. And so they end up taking something that's a little bit different. They get to psychology 130 and they haven't fulfilled the prerequisite requirement. They want to take chemistry 115, but it's offered at the same day, same time as another class. They need to take chemistry 180 and they are a daytime student and the only section is offered in the evening. These are the types of things that students face in reality when they go to register. And so our ability to do smart scheduling is what can impact a student's success. And you can see how this has those true impacts on individual students. So I want to just highlight a quick case study from Glenville State University, and I want to just call your attention to the top right part of this screen. And so sometimes when we work with institutions, the hard part or the way to get them on board is really to think through this process that you might offer fewer courses, but still be able to get that enrollment. And so when we talk about the strategies, and I promise I'm getting to those in just a second, one of the things that we want to highlight is you are going to have to do your scheduling a little bit differently. And so if you look at the quote that's at the bottom of the screen, it says, start with the data and make changes based on things that you have to change. Don't start with how it's been, because that's not going to work. And so part of this is a belief that we're making the right decisions. And so in their case, they were able to reduce the total number of sections that they were offering in this single program. And so you can see that it was looking at an Associate of Science in Business and a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and trying to consolidate offerings. And so in this case, it went from offering about 20 courses per every term to 9. And in that same time, as they reduced those sections down, they were able to grow their enrollment by 18%. And so what that means is you're offering the right courses at the right time, which in some cases, again, you have to have that leap of faith and believe that the intentionality with scheduling can actually improve what students are going to have access to, even if you're offering fewer courses overall. Okay. So here we are. Now we're at the where do I begin? I think this is the reason most of you, some action steps that you would want to be able to take as you're going through this process. And so step one is to prepare. And so one of the things that we are really, really passionate about is this top sort of bulleted point, which is acknowledging that course scheduling is a student success strategy. And so I want to point out a couple of different things. So I was at a recent presentation at a system office, which had a number of schools represented, and they were asked to complete this concept of a landscape analysis. So what are all the different programs and things that are contributing to retention and completion on your campuses? And as you might imagine, lots and lots of things came up. So advising, supplemental instruction, tons and tons of a summer bridge program, all kinds of activities were listed in this landscape analysis. But the one thing that was not listed at all was course scheduling. Similarly, if you look at the 2021 Effective Practices for Student Success, Retention, and Completion report, also from Ruffalo and Noel Levitz, one of the things that you might note is that there is no mention whatsoever of course scheduling as a strategy, not a single time. So, and in this report, it has general kind of strategies and tactics and the percentage that institutions are using it. So advising is listed as 100% usage. Professional advising, 93% of the time. Academic plans and roadmaps, 93% of the time. So if you think about the other areas within this webinar in terms of what we're talking about, so integrating degree maps, advising, smart scheduling, those things are being included already. But course scheduling as that strategy is not something that's really recommended. And that's over about 30 strategies or tactics per area. The second part of that really kind of focuses on things that are called management practices. And there's things like benchmarking performance, identifying DFW rates, looking at course sequencing, tracking the credit hours that students are completing per term. And so there are 20-ish different practices that are at play in this report. Again, looking at course scheduling, not something that's listed. So step one is having your campus be on board with the fact that whether a student can get the course they need is a retention and completion imperative. And so that's something that we're really passionate about, something that we think that all institutions need to understand. This is it. I agree with you. Whether a student can get a course they need is probably not the single thing that would prevent a student from being retained, but it's a part of that bigger picture. The second part of this is really around benchmarking. So how can you analyze your existing data on course scheduling? How do you look at how courses have been performing? Which ones have had low demand? Which ones have been completely full over time? Think about your enrollment patterns post-COVID. One of the things that we've seen at our institutions is that there's more and more levels of online than we saw in fall of 2019. But we're also seeing situations where sometimes that window of time, your course offerings, we call it prime time, where more of your course offerings are being offered, that window has narrowed post-COVID. And so that has an impact on your students as well. What is the state of your pathways? Do you have 100% coverage across all of your different programs? Are there some situations where there are gaps? Are you seeing some situations where those need to be reviewed? And then finally, look at your retention and graduation rates. And if possible, look at some of those more proactive metrics. So retention and graduation rates, as we know, measured in arrears. But if you're able to look at things like degree velocity and in-progress metric for retention and graduation and momentum year, how can that help you be able to intervene a lot more quickly? Okay. The second area is we're titling Be Curious. And so if there's some alignment here, of course, with the cultural aspect, but we recommend that you interview some stakeholders. Go and talk to your advising community. So we do a consulting engagement where we go and talk to all the stakeholders involved in scheduling. And my favorite group to meet with, other than the students themselves, are the advisors. And that's because boots on the ground, they're meeting with the student and they understand the pain that the student experiences when they can't get the schedule that they need. And so our advice is talk to those groups. You will get a wealth of information about those roadblocks that are impacting students, but also talk to all the scheduling stakeholders, understand the perspective that they're coming from. And so oftentimes I'm one of those people that I can think that there's an issue and I can come up with 10 different scenarios about what might be happening. But what I should do is just ask, what's the motivation behind this? Why are you doing it this way? Are there factors that we don't know about? And that speaks to the second point, which is around what is holding you back? Are there financial constraints? Do you have issues from an instructional perspective where you don't have enough faculty in certain cases? Like, what is it that's holding us back from being able to ensure that we're offering what we need to offer? Here's what I know in 15 years of working at Astra and 10 years before that of working in scheduling, no one wants to offer a schedule that isn't in alignment. Right? No one wants to offer classes that are going to get canceled a little bit later, yet we know cancellations happen. No one wants to not be able to offer enough courses for students to be able to get a full schedule, but we see that happen too. So what are the things that are holding us back from being able to do what we want to be able to do here? Be sure that you're communicating what your definition of student success is. We talked about this already. And then finally, I heard this last week. So we've all heard of SMART goals, but I loved this addition of ensuring that those SMART goals are also inclusive and equitable. So we have seen all of the data recently about the issues associated with equity in education. We know that there are gaps at place, and that we know that there are ways from an institutional perspective that we are contributing to that. So are there things from a scheduling perspective that we can take on that we know can ensure that there's more inclusivity? For example, do we notice that certain populations of students register later than others? And we know that sometimes those schedules that we get later during the registration cycle are not as optimal as what we see earlier. So what are the ways that we can ensure that the student who registers in the middle of the summer is going to have a schedule that's going to be just as good as the student that registers the first day that registration opens. And so those are the types of things that we can start to think through. So adding that inclusivity and equity into our SMART goals is something that we think is really valuable and important. The next step is around organizing. So you can see here that I'm saying establish or reestablish. So most institutions have policies and procedures around scheduling, but sometimes we see that those aren't being used. And so I listed some important ones here, but there are more policies and procedures to consider. But I am an advocate at the moment for thinking about your meeting pattern grid. So as we are working with institutions over the last year, what we're seeing, again, we're seeing lots of situations where single sections are being offered, meaning students only have access to get the schedule, that section one time throughout the scheduling week. For a lot of institutions, and on average, about 70% of your offerings are offered as a single section. So that puts a lot of pressure on you from an institutional perspective to be able to offer those things conflict-free. And in the way that we build schedules, where it's not really a lot of collaboration taking place between departments, of course, you're going to get into situations where those things are in conflict. Adding to that, that not everyone is following the same days and times from an offering perspective means there's even more likelihood of some of those overlaps occurring. And so oftentimes when we're working with institutions where we're saying, okay, well, I'm offering this business administration class and I'm doing it on Monday, Wednesday, and not Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because my students just need to take the class Monday, Wednesday. But they don't really think through what those overlaps look like. And are there situations where students cannot take their general education courses because of those practices? Those are the things that we need to consider. We often hear a lot of consternation about cancellations. We know that it negatively impacts the students, but it also negatively impacts the faculty. What are the ways that we can start to look at that information ahead of time? How do we implement our cancellation policies so that we understand exactly what's happening? And then are there situations that our classroom usage is dictating what we can really do from a scheduling perspective? And so how do these things fit together? So organize around what are those key areas of infrastructure within scheduling that you need to work on. This might be my favorite slide. And so if you have no other takeaways, let's talk about this one. The intentionality of scheduling is so important. And so I've already discussed the importance of pathways and degree maps, and you can see that there's a couple things here that I've already talked about. So thinking about demand, are there situations where you can combine demand into a single term so that you can take advantages of the economies of scale? So if you have 5 students who need a course on pathway A in the fall, and you have 5 students who need the course on pathway B, the same course, is it possible to push that into a single term and get 10 students into that section? In other cases, think about your English 101. Is it possible to be able to balance up more of that instead of offering, 90% of the English 101 offerings in the fall? Is there a way to balance some of that into spring? And how do we ensure that all of the absolute requirements are offered in the term that they're mentioned? What are the impacts of VFWs on our data? What are the impacts of electives? I did a recent study for an institution where we looked at withdrawals only, and we found that of the 120 courses that were most bottlenecked for this institution, about 9% of those seats were taken by students who ultimately withdrew. And then furthermore, when the students took that second course or took the course for the second time, 46% of those students failed the course. So what sort of institutional ways can we take a look at both withdrawals, but then also how do we support those students who are withdrawing to ensure that they don't have that failure in the second attempt? Completion paths, we believe, are the what, where, and how you are offering an individual course. So are you offering it online or on ground, in the daytime or the evening, on a particular campus? And so, you see listed here this concept of completion paths. If I come into an institution and I'm able to take all my gen ed classes at at a satellite campus, but then after that, I'm going to have to go to the main campus for my major courses. Those are things that I need to know and understand going in. If I'm an online student and I want to be able to complete my coursework completely online, but I get to a roadblock where potentially some of the classes aren't offered in that online format, I need to know that up front. And so we need to understand where there are enough students to be able to ensure that those offerings are sustainable, and where are there situations where there's not enough demand, not enough student populations to be able to fragment that into multiple different modes of delivery. And then finally, what are the guardrails that we can use associated with that? So if you can't afford to offer an evening program for a certain population of students, how can we ensure that you're not offering a section here and there? So, and then what is the capacity overall that you have here? What capacity do you have from a faculty perspective? What do you have from a space capacity perspective? And that can help you be able to determine some of these needs. So one of the things that I want to mention is we've had a lot of work in the 8-week term area. And so some of the analysis work that we've been doing recently is around how many of your programs could complete in an 8-week format. And so for some institutions, for a large system in Texas, in fact, we found that about 50% of the offerings were available in that 8-week format. And so this is where I want to re-emphasize the intentionality. Oftentimes, we are just trying to throw things out there and hope that it all meets those needs, right? We're thinking through things like we want to do a late start term in case we miss a few students along the way. We want to be able to do 8 weeks and 16 weeks. We want to do online. We want to do multiple campuses. So how do we figure out the structure that we need so that students can be successful? So imagine that a student comes to a satellite campus and they have to combine some 15-week terms, and they have to take some classes on the main campus, and they have to take some online campus. It creates this sense of disconnectedness for the student as well. And so from an intentionality, what is our strategy associated with this offering? If we're going to open a new campus, what program should we couple together to ensure that we have those offerings in the right place? And so that's what we mean by intentionality, that every scheduling decision that you're making has the component of why are we doing it and who are we serving in that need, in that specific situation. So again, back to Laura's original statement around smart scheduling, how do we meet the needs of our students? The final component is around refinement. So after you've started doing some of this work, how can we measure our progress? Think back to what I mentioned in the beginning. We want to have some KPIs, which could include things like degree, velocity, momentum year. We want to think about scheduling metrics and what are some things, what's your overall fill rate in some of your classes? What are some easy things that you can start to monitor on a term-by-term basis? And then we also want to continue to talk about the importance of disaggregating metrics, whether that's by equity or whether that's even in the individual departments and things like that. So what are the ways that we can look at a finer level of detail in order to be able to make some decisions? Where possible, scale with technology. So utilize your existing systems, understand where the gaps are, and then be able to add technology where it's necessary. And then the final point from a refinement lens is the opportunity to be able to offer ongoing training. So one thing that I would say is I think the most turnover in any area within higher ed sometimes is at that department chair level, and that's a pivotal position in being able to make decisions about scheduling. So are there opportunities to be able to train those department chairs on what are the key components that we should look at when we're going about doing scheduling, where we can ensure that we are meeting the needs of our students and not just rolling things over from term to term. So from a departmental perspective, if you come in as a new department chair, of course, it's going to be easier to offer what you offered last time. But are there ways that we can figure out kind of finite things to be able to analyze and review that can make that schedule better? And then, of course, for all scheduling stakeholders as well. So I have done a lot of talking, but I want to make time for questions. We didn't have a lot during the mix, and probably Susan might tell me that I didn't even pause enough for her to break in. But at this point, we want to be sure we have time to answer any questions that you might have. And so, Susan, I don't know if you have any already that you want me to just start answering here.
Sure, we do have some that have come through. Let me share one. it is about pathways, so you're going to just love this question, Laura. So our pathways are built assuming that a student's going to be full-time, right, with no incoming credit, or are built assuming that they're ready to start in calculus, even though they're not prepared to start in calculus. So how do you go about accounting for those situations where students can't jump into that pathway right away?
So I love that question. I also love the math lens to it, especially because we have two mathematicians on the line. I am not one of them, but I think that's great. So my advice from a pathways perspective is to, at first, think through what's your most common use case. So it's back to know your students. And so if you're at an institution and you have an engineering major and 70% of your engineering students do not come in with calculus as their first math, then let's think about ways to be able to update that pathway. And so in many cases, what I've found is we think about that idealized view, but if a student that comes in and is not ready for calculus is not going to be able to graduate in 4 years, what are the ways that we could ensure that that could happen? And so that makes us think through that pathway in a different way. Whether that means that we want them to take a summer course, or we have to think through what that sequencing could look like. My advice is, what is your majority use case, and let's optimize for that. The second part that I would say is we still need to be able to evaluate based on something. So having a pathway is really, really important. And then you can start to think through, okay, where are students falling down? If we have a part-time pathway, which courses do the students need to get in certain sequences? We've had a lot of discussion about the 8-week terms, so the 7 and 8-week terms that are coming up. And so those are some of the things that, and that means if suddenly you're taking things in 8-week terms, you can change some of the sequencing of how students flow through. So top advice is be intentional, think about your students, know what your students are doing, and that can help you be able to look at the data. And we know that there's a lot more transfers, there's a lot more dual credit, there's students who are not prepared. So pretty much off the bat, some of that is going to change. And that's the reason why Laura's point earlier, you have the academic map, but you also have the educational plan that you're working with on a student by student basis.
Okay.
Other questions?
Sure, a short one and a little bit longer one. I'll start with a short one. Our vocabulary, actually. Could you just share real quickly a definition, degree velocity and momentum year?
Of course. So degree velocity is an in-progress metric that's designed to simulate how quickly a student's moving through to degree. And I actually think we can kind of I'll just pop this up really quickly. So Nicole helped me, I think, by adding the slide into the deck. So this will be something that's included, but it's basically looking at your productive credits per year divided by the expected credits that you would take. So if you are supposed to complete 30 credits per year to be on track, if you think about the 15 to finish that Laura talked about in the beginning, then ideally you'd have 30 credits. If you only had 25, then your degree velocity is going to be 75% of what we would expect. And so that's a quick definition of degree velocity. On the momentum year side, the definition is really to complete an college level math, 9 credits in the program and 30 credits overall in that first year. And so those are the key components of momentum year. I think maybe we have a little bit of that listed here as well. And so you can see what that looks like. So just some key definitions that make sense. So the important thing to note is degree velocity is hopefully, again, that in progress metric where you can see how quickly students are moving through in anticipation of that overall graduation rate. And then same thing on momentum year. It's a way to see early, are students going to move through at that pace that you might recommend?
Another question is about how we process information around pathways. How's that information processed? Does IT troubleshoot that information if the software is used on our campus? And how much data is shared with Ad Astra, such as names of students, grades, etc.?
Sure, it's a great question. So obviously we are processing all of the academic, in our software, we're processing all the academic history, and that comes from the student information system. And on the pathway side, it really depends on where you're housing that information. And there's a lot of different ways in terms of what we've seen. Some of our institutions have student planners, student educational planner, things like that, where they're housing the pathways. EAB Navigate, for example. In other situations, they're just available on the website or in the catalog. And so we do digitize pathways and then do a comparison of the academic history and that pathway data. So that's how we process it. In terms of what needs to be provided, we have kind of standard interfaces to the student information systems, as you might imagine. You have some decisions that you can make about whether you want to include student names. We do look at grades because we are analyzing individual, as I said, DFWs and things like that. But certainly you have some flexibility in terms of providing names and other data associated with equity as well. Other questions that you have at this point? So I just, you will obviously have access to the slides as well, but if you have a quick question for either Laura, then you can jot down our information here really quickly.
So
Susan, oh, go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to jump in really quickly to mention something sort of with regards to the last question that was asked. You know, that question was really specific about what would happen if once people engaged or if they engaged at Astra. And I think that's really important. But I also want to sort of balance that with a lot of the stuff that came up in this webinar. And as we think about first steps, right? In some ways that engaging people to do an analysis, whether it's at Astra or somebody else, right? As you do that analysis, that isn't really the first step. Right? There are all of these other things that we were talking about that you're going to want to have in place first. And so what we're not asking you to do, right, based on this webinar is to say, okay, we're ready to engage with Ad Astra or some kind of equivalent partner. I mean, obviously, the people from Ad Astra that are on the call would love for that to be an eventual thing for you. But really, this is about you thinking through what it is that you will need to do on your campus to be able to be ready to do some kind of analysis and to do the kind of scaling that you would need technology to be able to do.
I think that's absolutely right, Laura, and I thank you for pointing that out. Certainly, when we talk about KPIs and metrics, you know, we have scheduling metrics, we have degree velocity. Momentum year is something you can calculate. You have IPEDS data. Like there's tons, as I mentioned in that introductory slide, there's lots and lots of data that you already have to be able to start down this process. And so certainly that's what we recommend, is doing that kind of landscape analysis of what is happening on my campus, what do I know about my students, and how can I start making some iterative progress. And you know, there's all kinds of ways, you know, that like if I had one piece of advice for an institution to take, I would say go look at your meeting patterns and see how many distinct and that's not something that you need Ad Astra for. Go and look at your distinct meeting patterns and see how many overlaps you have. And that probably will take you pretty far down path in terms of something is going on with my scheduling that I need to start pulling back layers on. Okay, so I am going to just quickly highlight that we appreciate so much your attendance here today. But if you're interested in continuing this conversation, I mentioned our 2024 benchmark report a little bit earlier. There is going to be a webinar on March 26th. You see all the relevant detail here. It will have our founder and CEO, Tom Shaver, and then also Charles Ansel from Complete College Americas participating, along with Dr. Trent and Dr. Rayleigh as well. So you can see that. The QR code is again up in that top right corner, but ultimately, again, this will be shared out. So just kind of food for thought. If you're interested in continuing this type of conversation, there's a webinar in a couple of weeks that will focus on that.
Right. So I think we're out of time. I just want to make sure to thank our Ad Astra partners. We at Complete College America, we could never do this work alone, right? Across all of the strategies. And we are just so lucky to have partners like Ad Astra who have done all of this work in the field and can come in alongside and can really, that we can support and who can support us in really getting colleges to move the needle on the things that they care about. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ad Astra, for being here, and you will be hearing from us with an email that has, as I mentioned, a link to the recording and the slide deck and to all of the reports and things that were mentioned in the call today. So thank you for being here.